All right, welcome back. We are in lesson 3 about our boy Beowulf, and we are about to lead up to his battle with Grendel. So, if you would please open up your text and scroll down to where you see the battle with Grendel, and it's line 390 on the document I sent you. Okay? All right, here we go. Now, when we left off, Beowulf and Hrothgar and all of the men had partied, right? And then Beowulf had asked to fight the monster with just him and his guys. So everybody else leaves after the party. And now it's nighttime, and Beowulf and his men are in the hall by themselves. Okay? But this part doesn't actually start in the hall. We start from Grendel's perspective, just like we did earlier in the poem. So picking up with line 390. Out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred. Remember that Grendel has been separated from God because he's a descendant of Cain, right? Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Herat. So he's willing to kill anybody who gets in his way. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before. Yeah, obviously, like for years, right? Knew the way. But never, before nor after that night, found Herat defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. So we're getting a little foreshadowing, like that the fight he's going to have with Beowulf is the harshest fight he's ever had, and the like it's going to be the hardest thing he's ever done. He journeyed, forever joyless, straight to the door, and then snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. It's terrifying, right? Especially the contrast of how quietly he went through the countryside and how much he snuck up, and then when he comes through the door, bang, he's all snarling and growling and teeth and breaking stuff. He, sorry. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together, right? Every time he's broken in here for years, he's killed people and people stopped staying there, right? So he's not expecting them to be a bunch of warriors. His reaction here is really interesting, though. And his heart laughed. Why? Here's why. He relished the sight, intending to tear the life from those bodies by morning. So he's like, this is brilliant. There's warriors here, and I can kill them. Yeah, he's a horror movie monster. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Ooh. Remember we were taking notes about fate? Here, the poet is using fate to show us foreshadowing, to tell us what's going to happen here. And by telling us a little bit about what's going to happen, right, we start thinking, well, how? Yeah? Okay. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Who's watching him? Yeah, Beowulf, right? Okay, because remember, all the guys are sleeping in the hall, except Beowulf isn't sleeping. He's just pretending to sleep. And I'm sure you've done that, right? like you were in your bed or you're on the couch or whatever, and um, people think you're sleeping, but you're not, and you're actually like listening to them, or you've got one eye sort of barely open and you're watching what they're doing. Okay, that's what Beowulf's doing here. So it's building up the tension, right? It's getting more and more exciting because we know Beowulf is watching him. Grendel snatched at the first Geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down, hands and feet. Death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Oh, that's such fantastic description that Death and Grendel's teeth came together. Arr, that's brilliant. So he's grabbed one of Beowulf's men, ripped him apart, and eaten him. Beowulf is not going to take kindly to that sort of behavior, is he? Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws. Oh, big mistake there, Grendel. Grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself. Claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. Okay, so Beowulf was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, right? Laying down. Grendel grabs him, and Beowulf grabs back. And as Beowulf pushes up, Grendel's claws are being bent backwards. Okay, you got it? You picturing this? Now we're going to get it from Grendel's perspective here. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. So Beowulf has him, right? And Grendel suddenly he's scared because he's never met anybody who's his equal. And you know this from animals, right? If animals are scared, their first instinct is, or if they're hurting, the first instinct is get out of here, right? Run away, run away, run away. And that's what Grendel wants to do. He doesn't want to fight this guy. He doesn't want to fight an equal. He's happy to fight people who are weaker than him, but he doesn't want to fight an equal. So he wants to run, right? But he can't because Beowulf has his arm and he won't let go. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh, and hide there. This was a different Heorot than the hall he had emptied. It's like, this is not the place I've been causing chaos the last few years, right? But Hygelac's follower, Beowulf, remembered his final boast, and standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists until they cracked. So he's holding Grendel's claws so hard they're cracking. Wow. Clutched Grendel closer. So Grendel's, he's cracking his claws, and Grendel's trying to run, and Beowulf is pulling him towards him. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. He just wants to get away. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Heorot was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. The high hall rang, its roof boards swayed, and the Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles the battle swept, angry and wild. Okay, so right here's Grendel trying to get away, and Beowulf hanging on and pulling him close, and Grendel fighting and knocking stuff over and trying to push away. And you can imagine the chaos this is causing and the noise and stuff flying everywhere, right? Heorot trembled. Heorot's the hall. Wonderfully built to withstand the blows, the struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls, shaped and fastened with iron. Inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Okay, now why do we care that the building stood firm? Why does it matter? Because remember that Herat is the heart of the community, right? The mead hall, it's where everyone comes together. And if the heart of the community can stand firm, this is like representational, yeah? If it can stand firm during this huge battle, then maybe the community can still stand firm. Make sense? Okay, picking up on line 455. Its benches rattled, fell to the floor, gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Herat to stand forever. Only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. Okay, so, and remember from the beginning of the poem, we got kind of that warning that the ending of Herat many, many years from now comes in fire. So it is not going to be destroyed by this battle. And the architects had planned, they understood it's a wooden building and fire might hurt it, but they planned against everything else. And so it is standing firm and safe during this huge battle. Suddenly, the sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemy sang in the darkness. Horrible shrieks of pain and defeat. The tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hel's captive caught in the arms of him who of all the men on earth was the strongest. Okay, so suddenly it isn't a sound of like stuff falling over and these guys fighting. Suddenly Grendel is screaming. Oh, you can just imagine it, right? He's screaming. Why is he screaming? We're going to find out. Scroll down past the number 9 to where the text shifts. That mighty protector of men, this is Beowulf, meant to hold the monster till its life leapt out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. So he was going to hold on to that creature and kill it, because if he let it go, it wasn't going to do any good for anybody. All of Beowulf's band, all of his men, had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. So they're not joining in the fight with Grendel because he said, I'm going to do this one-on-one, and he's not using a sword. But they're ready to protect him. So if Grendel goes for him, they'll fight to protect him. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul. But their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin, for all that sin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. Okay, so they could fight him as much as they wanted to, but he has cast spells so that weapons cannot hurt him. Now here's the irony. Beowulf didn't know that, right? Beowulf vowed to fight him in hand-to-hand combat because Grendel didn't use any weapons. Not because Grendel, he knew, he didn't know anything about Grendel, like whether or not he could be hurt by them. So the irony here is that Beowulf made the choice to fight him without weapons, and that's the right choice, even though he didn't know why it was the right choice. He did it for honor. But it turns out weapons can't hurt Grendel. So all these guys with swords, they're not going to hurt him at all. But look at line 486. And yet his time had come. His days were over, his death near. Down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. So we're straight up being told Grendel is going to die and he's going to hell. Now he discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him. His claws bound fast, Higlac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped. Muscle and bone split and broke. So Beowulf is pulling so hard at Grendel's arm that he literally ripped his arm out of its socket and ripped his arm off his body. That's why Grendel was screaming. I'd scream too. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he was, could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. Okay, so Beowulf literally rips Grendel's arm off, and Grendel can finally get away, right? Because they've been basically playing tug of war with Grendel's arm. Grendel runs, but he's bleeding out, understandably. This is a major wound. And so he's bleeding out, and he goes down into his cave in the marsh, but he goes there to die. And obviously leaving blood and grossness behind him. And then we get that moment of triumph, just sheer triumph from Beowulf and his men. Okay, jumping down to line 506. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Heorot clean. He was happy now with that night's fierce work. The Danes who had been served as he'd boasted he'd serve them. Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw and shoulder and all. So Beowulf took the arm and hung it up in the rafters of Heorot as a trophy. So everybody knew that Heorot was safe. Everybody knew he defeated the monster, and that's the trophy. It's pretty gruesome. I mean, I wouldn't want to eat and drink with like a bloody arm ripped off on the ceiling. That's pretty gross. But they're seeing it as like a trophy of victory. Okay, so we're going to keep going here a little bit, and we're going to get with the celebration, because after the battle, right, the celebration is part of that battle. So scroll down, go past where it says 10. And then in the morning, crowds surrounded Heorot, warriors coming to that hall from faraway lands, princes and leaders of men hurrying to behold the monster's great staggering tracks, because Grendel left footprints and blood and guts and everything. They gaped with no sense of sorrow, felt no regret for his suffering. 'Cause we're not supposed to sympathize with Grendel, even though we kind of do. And these people don't. Like, he was terrorizing them for years. They're glad he's gone. Felt no regret for his suffering. Went tracing his bloody footprints, his beaten and lonely flight to the edge of the lake, where he dragged his corpse-like way, doomed and already weary of his vanishing life. The water was bloody, steaming and boiling in horrible pounding waves, heat sucked from his magic veins. But the swirling surf had covered his death, hidden deep in murky darkness, his miserable end, as hell opened to receive him. Then old and young rejoiced, turned back from that happy pilgrimage, mounted their hard-hooved horses, high-spirited stallions, and rode them slowly toward Heorot again, retelling Beowulf's bravery as they jogged along. And over and over, they swore that nowhere on earth or under the spreading sky or between the seas, neither south nor north, was there a warrior worthier to rule over men. But no one meant Beowulf's praise to belittle Hrothgar, their kind and gracious king. Okay, so we get their joyful celebration, but also like they follow the footsteps and see where the monster went. And kind of make sure that it's dead. I mean, they don't see Grendel's body. We will see that later in the poem, but they don't see it there. But they can tell that he's dead. And the story of Beowulf's bravery is just growing and growing, and the community's coming back together, right? Because the monster's gone and because the danger's gone. So we see exactly what we wanted coming back together. An interesting little note at the end there, isn't it? That they're praising Beowulf and they're like, he'll be a great king, he'll be a great leader because he's protected us. But Hrothgar's good too. We don't, nothing bad about Hrothgar. So the poet wanted to make sure that we didn't disrespect the current king who couldn't fix the problem by praising Beowulf. Like they're both good, and don't disrespect the current king because that would be bad, right? All right, so we're going to leave it there for section 3. You're going to go back into your notes and do your section 3 notes. Okay? And go back into Schoology, make sure you do your activities, and I will meet you back here for part 4.